Good afternoon, everyone. Oops, that's a little too loud, I think. So please welcome to Rice and to the Baker Institute and today's lecture. Please continue to munch away quietly. There are more sandwiches back there, there's more drink, and there are more cookies. Today, we're going to hear a very important perspective on an extremely complicated and important to everybody on Earth issue. And I look forward to introducing the speaker in just a moment. I do want, before I do that, to acknowledge our co-sponsors of today's luncheon talk, the Science Technology Policy Program, Dr. Kirsten Matthews, and the Center for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute. Ken Medlock runs that program, and the CENHS, a new center for energy and environmental research in the human sciences. So now I do want to introduce our speaker today, Andy Dessler. Many of you know Andy Dessler, familiar figure at Rice University. You may know Andy's father, Alex Dessler, who was the founding chair of our Space Science Department, the first Space Science Department in the United States. Andy is currently professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M University, and his expertise includes climate science, especially feedback effects, which are particularly challenging, water and clouds and such things. And he's also an expert in climate policy and related political issues. He received his BA in physics here at Rice University. Must have been a BS in physics at Rice University. Was a BA? We gave a BA in those days. And a PhD in chemistry at Harvard University, where I first got to know Andy. And prior to grad school, he worked at Wall Street. And once he had that figured out, he decided to take on something more challenging, and so that brought him to climate science. He did postdoc work at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center and spent 9 years on the research faculty at the University of Maryland. He served as an editor of the American Geophysical Union Books Board and as associate editor for the Journal of Geophysical Research. During the last year of the Clinton administration, fortunate for us, he worked with us in the White House, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, on related environmental and climate issues. He was a senior policy analyst with the White House. This experience perhaps helped encourage him to write the first of his two books on climate change, which some of you will have read, The Science and Politics of Global Climate Change, A Guide to the Debate, which was in 2006 and then reissued in 2010. He co-wrote that with Edward Parson. 2006, he completed the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program Fellowship at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, and later in 2011, he published Introduction to Modern Climate Change, Cambridge publication, 2011, and that won him the 2014 Lewis J. Batten Authors Award from the American Meteorological Society. 2011, Google honored Andy as one of 21 Google Science Communication Fellows for his work in fostering accessible scientific dialogue in the climate change field. And I emphasize accessible scientific dialogue. 2012, he received the American Geophysical Union's Ascent Award from the Atmospheric Sciences section to reward exceptional achievement by mid-career scientists. And he lives in College Station, just up the street here, with his wife, 2 kids, dog. He's an avid glider pilot, as I understand, and today Andy's talk is entitled The Alternative Reality of Climate Skepticism. Please join me in welcoming Rice's own Andy Dessler.
Great, so thanks a lot. I really appreciate the introduction, Neil. And let's see, have this right? And down. Oh, there it is. So, I think a lot of my policy, interest in policy comes from when I was working at OSTP. So this is the 1999 OSTP Christmas party. One of us is drunk. I won't say who. This is the Indian Treaty Room in the OEOB. So a lot of when I was there, I really saw how science was used and misused, and I sort of developed this interest. And I went back to University of Maryland, and I was teaching classes, and I realized the students were much more interested in policy than they were in Sigma T to the fourth. So I really started thinking about that, and just my own interactions with people, and the more I learned about climate, the more I realized it's really a policy problem as much as it is a science problem. So I'm going to talk today about what I've termed the alternate reality of climate. There it is. The alternate reality of climate change. And so it starts with these people that, not me and Dr. Lane. This is not a younger picture of us. And so this is an episode of Star Trek where, as in they all begin the same way, which is Kirk beams down to a planet. He fights off a green alien, and then he's beaming back. There's a transporter accident, and he gets transported into this alternate universe where things are kind of like the old universe, but they're different. So Spock has a beard in this alternate universe, and Spock is evil. He's still logical, but he's evil in this other universe. And so I'm going to present this idea that there are these two realities of climate science out there. There's reality that virtually all the actual climate change experts believe in, and there's this alternate reality which you can choose to believe. And so we'll talk about that. And I'm going to try to answer the question of what is the alternate reality, and then I'll answer the question about why construct an alternate reality. I mean, what's the whole point of doing this? All right, so before I begin, I always like to just go over the core fundamental things that scientists believe about the climate system. So, and four things. If this is all you remember, then I think I still have succeeded. So the first one is the Earth is warming, and it's warmed about 0.85 degrees Celsius, and so you double that to get Fahrenheit. So about 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit over basically the 21st century, 1880 to 2012. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot, and you can really reasonably say, who cares? 0.85 degrees Celsius, 1.3 degrees. But your intuition on this is based on your local experience. It might be 10 degrees colder at night than it is during the day. It might have been 20 degrees warmer yesterday than it is today. And so you could logically think, why do a few degrees matter? And the answer is that when you talk about the global average, very seemingly small changes have a big impact. So let's sort of ask you, I'm guessing certainly some people know this, how much colder was the last ice age? Anybody? Shout it out. Yeah, 5 degrees, 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius. So if you think about that, that's really remarkable. If you cool the planet 5 degrees Celsius, about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, you get an ice age. And so you talk about 1 degree of warming, that's a lot. And so we'll talk about even more warming. We talk about the prediction. So the Earth is warming. We've gone through attribution studies, and it's extremely likely that the human influence is a dominant cause. So climate has varied over all time scales over the entire human history. But humans have taken over control of the climate on decadal and centennial timescales. We still don't control the year-to-year climate. Things like El Nino cycles control year-to-year climate. So next year could be colder than this year, but 50 years, 100 years are almost certainly going to be warmer than it is now, because we now control that by changing the radiative forcing on the planet. Likely warming during the 21st century will be 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. And I remember talking to a student in my class, and we were talking about how much the last ice age was about 4 degrees cooler, and the warming projected for the next century is 4 degrees. She goes, there must be some mistake. She said the last ice age was 4 degrees cooler, but we're projecting as much as 4 degrees of warming. I said, yeah, that's right. And you can sort of see the light go on in her eyes. This is why you should be concerned about this. I mean, it took 10,000 years for us to warm out of the last ice age, and the Earth has changed a lot. Now imagine you have that same warming over the next 100 years. Now, I'm not sure this is going to be bad, but there are lots of ways it could be really, really bad, and it should compel our attention. So that's all I'm going to really talk about this. I'm happy to answer questions about it. I can and have gone on for an entire semester about these questions. So, but in the interest of sort of staying to the topic, I really can't fit a lot more science in on this. But feel free to ask me questions about this. But the point I want to make is these are things to remember, and essentially everybody who you would rationally consider to be an expert, and I'll talk more about this in a second, agrees with this. So there have been papers, people have surveyed experts, 97% agree. There have been papers looking at the peer-reviewed literature that show, again, 97%. I don't know why that number keeps coming up. And I have to tell you, I actually have read neither of these papers, and the answer is because I don't have to. I mean, I read the literature every day. It's my job. I talk to climate scientists every day. It's my job. I go to meetings every month. I probably go to one meeting a month. So I know what the scientific community thinks, and that's what they think. I mean, you go to a meeting, you just don't hear anything else. And to give you an idea of how hard you have to work to get an alternative viewpoint, this was just a few days ago. So the TPPF, Texas Public Policy Foundation, you might have heard of them, they wanted to have a balanced view of climate change. And so they have a panel with 4 people on it. And they do have 2 legitimate climate skeptics who would disagree with the points I made before. But look, they had to fly them in from out of state. You know, I've been involved in a lot of debates, and there are so few of these people that they're endlessly recycled. And, you know, you fly them in from Canada or Australia, or they got some closer ones, Alabama and Georgia. I'm referring to Dr. Spencer and Dr. Curry, who are credentialed atmospheric scientists. I don't dispute them, but they're very, 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 very far in the minority. And, you know, they do have a mainstream scientist on here, Dr. Yang from UT. And, you know, if you want a mainstream scientist, they're all over the place. You can go to UT, you can go to A&M. And again, the point is, if you try to find a scientist who disagrees with those points, you can find them, but there aren't very many of them, and you probably will have to go. I mean, if there was legitimate debate, there would be some skeptics in Texas, in the atmospheric department, science department at A&M, or at Rice, or at UT, or at Texas Tech, and they really just don't exist. So the point I want to make is that there really is widespread agreement among the people who you'd consider experts on this. But that creates a big problem. And the problem is, if you don't want policy on climate change, or actually, let me go. Why does that create a problem? Okay, so people are very sophisticated about policy debates, and so this is a memo by Frank Luntz, who, if you study political strategy, you'll have heard of him, and it's basically on how to win the global warming debate. And basically what he says is, I actually like the first part. It says, please keep in mind the following communication recommendations as you address global warming in general, particularly as Democrats and opinion leaders attack President Bush over Kyoto. And I was reading that the other day. I thought, President Bush attacking Bush over Kyoto. That's like, you know, seersucker suits and, you know, the good old days of climate. And the point is that the scientific debate remains open. Voters believe there's no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. And so that's why the consensus among the experts is a big problem for people who don't want action on climate. If you don't want action on climate, you absolutely cannot admit that virtually all the experts agree with the mainstream views that I did. If you do, you lose the policy debate, according to Frank Luntz. I'm actually not sure that's right, but anyway, that was the argument he made. And so breaking down the consensus is this key argument. And this is right out of the tobacco company's playbook. So this is 1964. This is the cover of 1964 report on smoking. So Terry Luther, Surgeon General, put this out. And this is probably 10 years after scientists really understood that cigarettes cause cancer. And in it, I don't expect anyone to read this, but here's sort of the key sentence. So cigarette smoking is associated with a 70% increase in the age-specific death rates of males and to a lesser extent with the increased death rate of females. And it goes on to talk about lung cancer and emphysema and heart disease and all the other things. Now, how do you think the tobacco companies responded to this? So did they say, okay, you got us, cigarettes kill people, we acknowledge that? And the answer is, of course, they didn't do that. They didn't do that because they recognized that to do that was to lose the policy debate. And so what they do? Well, luckily, we have decades of memos written by tobacco company executives that were released under litigation in the 90s. And so nobody can read this, I realize that. So hopefully you might be able to read this. So this is some cog at some, I'm not sure which firm this was, but he's reacting to it. And he says, we must in the near future provide some answers which will give smokers a psychological crutch and a self-rationale to continue smoking. These answers must also point up the weaknesses in the report. And so, I mean, this is the tobacco company playbook. And the climate debate, there are these organizations out there, they've got the tobacco company playbook on their desk open, they're going through it page by page. And so this is probably the most famous memo. This is 1969 from an executive at Brown and Williamson. And this is the most famous quote, I think, about doubt. It says, doubt is our product, since it is the best way of competing with a body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the best way of establishing a controversy. And it goes on, it goes on. But the point is, these people knew what they were doing. This was probably 20 years, or at least 15 years after the science was actually settled. The large longitudinal studies connecting cigarettes with health, that was settled in the mid-50s. By the mid-60s, the Surgeon General had issued a report. And by the end of the 60s, everybody knew this was true. In fact, there are memos that show the tobacco companies knew this was true. But they still knew that to win the policy debate, they had to push back on the science. And so we can actually see this. So I have to say, that just outrages me to see that. I mean, this is 25 years after they knew that was right. I mean, you don't know if this guy actually knew what he was saying was, I'm trying to think of a good way to say it, wrong. You don't know that, but I mean, there are lots of people at tobacco companies that knew that wasn't right. There weren't many independent men and women of science. The people that were arguing against it were all on their payroll, and the memos show that. And yet they continued to make the argument about science. So these arguments about science are key parts of the policy argument. And so when you see The Daily Show and Jon Stewart showing a clip of the House Science Committee arguing about whether melting ice raises sea level, that's not a legitimate argument about science. It's a policy argument. These people are trying to introduce uncertainty. They're trying to make it look like the science is not clear. And I won't say the science is settled. You can ask me if I think the science is settled. I have a long answer for that, which I won't belabor at this point. But to sort of keep the thread going, this is a key strategy that has been proven to work. And in fact, on the drive up here, I was talking to my father. If you watch what the NFL says about concussions, it is exactly the same thing. So when the NFL talks about concussions, they've got the tobacco playbook open, and Roger Goodell is going through it page by page. We need more research. It's really not clear. It's really the similarities in the rhetoric, the framing of the arguments are virtually identical. So I should have set that up. So that's Myron Ebell, who works at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And so he's explicitly coming right out. We can't lose the scientific debate. If we lose the scientific debate, we've lost it. So we have to attack the science. And it's that explicit. I will say that I actually get interviewed on this show, and then I looked at that picture. I looked at that picture, and I realized that I have a lot more gray hair now after working on climate for 10 years than I did, and I don't look as happy. Maybe that's I was at a Christmas party. So how do you do that? How do you try to convince people that the science is actually, that there's not consensus? I can tell you, I'm a climate scientist, everybody basically agrees. How do you make the argument? Well, you do stuff like this. You create this alternative infrastructure that people who don't want to believe can cite. So one example is this global warming petition project. And what they did is essentially, if you have a bachelor's degree in a technical subject, then you're an expert, and you can sign this petition. And so they say, we have 31,000 American scientists, including 9,000 with PhDs. And how many climate scientists are there? There's a few thousand in the US probably. So, we have many more scientists who disagree than agree. There's no consensus. And so with this, people can then start to refer to this. And so, for example, Rick Perry, running for president 4 years ago, he said in response, so this is the Washington Post has their fact checkers, and so they went to Rick Perry's campaign and said, where do you get your information on climate? And so it says, in response to our queries, Perry spokesman sent us a link to something called the Petition Project, which claims to have collected the signatures of 31,000 American scientists. And so you see how the infrastructure works. You put something on there, and I think we all know undergraduates are not experts in, almost anything. They really don't qualify as experts. I mean, if you had a health problem, you wouldn't go see a biology bachelor's degree, someone with a bachelor's degree in biology. I mean, you'd go see an MD. But yet they've created this, and then people can refer to it. And it sort of allows you, it's a brick. It's a brick you can use to build this edifice of this idea that, well, climate science isn't real. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about expertise. So this is something for the Heartland Institute. You'll hear more about the Heartland Institute. In fact, apparently, I've heard that there was an op-ed about climate written by Heartland people in the Houston Chronicle today. I haven't seen it. But the point is, this is about essentially a blog attacking two people that I know. So John Abraham, who's an associate professor of mechanical engineering, and Scott Mandia, a non-PhD meteorology instructor at a community college. So I know both of them. So Abraham is a professor of engineering at the University of St. Thomas, and Mandia has a master's degree in meteorology from Penn State. And Penn State is a good school. It's almost as good as A&M in meteorology. So it's so these people actually know. I mean, these people would be qualified to sign the Oregon petition because they have, they clearly have advanced degrees, but instead they're minimally qualified, and they have an embarrassing lack of credentials because they don't say what the Heartland Institute wants them to say. And so what you see is that we've redefined expertise. So ordinarily, an expert is somebody that knows a lot about the subject. And we all know that. It's common sense. I mean, we do this. If you want to build a house, you go get an architect. And you might actually ask the architect, what other houses have you built? If you go to a doctor, you want to get somebody who's really an expert, not just an MD, but someone who's an expert in that particular whatever disease that you might be interested in. And so expertise normally means you know a lot. But what the very clever thing that's happened is they've redefined expertise to be, you are an expert if you agree with me. And if you redefine, people sort of laugh, but it's true. If you redefine expertise to be those people who agree with me are experts, then you truly can say the experts are on my side. And that's why 31,000 scientists have signed the Oregon petition disputing climate change, because they agree with me. That makes them experts. But then you have these other people, Abraham and Mandia, who are equally, I would argue they're more qualified than most of the people on the list. But they're not experts because they don't agree with me. They don't tell me the things that I want to hear. And then the other thing you have to do is you really have to diminish real expertise. Again, because most people at their heart realize we should listen to experts. We do it all the time. You hire lawyers because they're experts. You hire architects. You go to doctors. I mean, hiring expertise is embedded in our society. So you have to sort of diminish it. And you diminish it by ways of, for example, you say, well, the experts, they're in it for the grant money. And this is really one of the funniest things I've ever read. This is Competitive Enterprise Institute, same group that Myron Ebell's from, about all aboard the climate gravy train. And best quote is, therefore, it's fair to ask just how well rewarded are climate scientists. As it turns out, by some measures, they are paid as well as corporate CEOs. I would like to see what those some measures are. And I mean, this is absurd. You won't get tenure if you don't get along. They're left-wing socialists. So again, part of the key thing is you have this group of experts, and in your heart, you know you ought to listen to the experts. So why do you not listen to them? Well, you have to basically decide you hate them. And so you see things like equating environmentalism with communism. And so, the old joke, this is a joke, how are environmentalists like watermelons? They're green on the outside, red on the inside. And, you can see the hammer and sickle right there. And this is sort of most explicitly stated in Václav Klaus, who I guess is the president or prime minister of the Czech Republic. And he basically said, the largest threat to freedom, democracy, the market economy, the prosperity at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century is no longer socialism. It is instead the ambitious, arrogant, unscrupulous ideology of environmentalism. And so, in some sense, I truly believe these people believe this. And if you do believe it, then their behavior kind of makes sense in one sense. If you actually think these people are trying to destroy the planet and trying to take away all your freedoms, then that makes, then a lot of what they do makes sense. And I will say that excellent book, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, Merchant of Doubt, describes the evolution of the people who were attacking the Soviet Union and communism in the 80s. When the Soviet Union fell apart, they looked around for a new enemy, and they saw environmentalists. And it really explains the trajectory of the people who have been fighting environmental regulations, ozone depletion, acid rain, those things. It's the same people. It's not necessarily the same people, but I'll get to that in a second. So they're immoral. So and here's just a quick clip from a Cato Institute briefing. Before I do it. So this is a billboard, the Heartland Institute. Again, you'll see Heartland. I still believe in global warming, do you? And that's the Unabomber. So the Unabomber apparently is really worried about climate change. And I mean, logically, that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't tell you anything about the science of climate change. But, again, you're trying to sort of paste bad feelings on a group of people that you really want to hate. Because if you don't hate them, it's hard to dismiss them. It's easier to dismiss them if you can make the argument that they're biased or corrupt. So now I think we have the clip. So, I mean, it's a key argument here that as part of diminishing real expertise. And, you end up with, you can't trust these people. Even though they're the experts, you really can't trust them. Instead, you should trust our experts, who by and large don't actually know anything about the subject. But they're not being paid. They don't have grants because they don't actually do any research on it. So they're not in it for the grant money. They don't have jobs, so they don't have to get tenure. Anyway, you can see the argument. It's and so this is a key strategy. It's a key strategy that's actually very successful, and it's pioneered by the tobacco company, although it's really been refined in the climate debate. And then there's sort of the rest of the infrastructure of the alternative realities. This is a cover of the 2007 IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. So this got the Nobel Peace Prize. It shared it with Al Gore in 2007. And then more recently, the IPCC's 2013 report came out. And again, you have to attack this. You cannot, if you oppose action on climate change, you cannot let these things stand. So you have to attack it as much as possible. And one of the ways you do it is you create your own report. And so this is, again, published by the Heartland Institute, Climate Change Reconsidered. And if you read it, it's, it gives you their view of what the IPCC says. And there are other reports. This is the Cato Institute. I love, so they made the covers almost identical. So this is a report by the U.S. CCSP, Climate Change Science Program. And then the Cato Institute put out their version of the report. And they made it look identical, except here's the temperature. This is the temperature of the last 120 years. And the Cato Institute took the last 10 or 15 years to put the point of which there's no real obvious trend, which I thought was interesting. And so when you think of these reports, it's useful to remember that, the reason to do this is you're creating reports that people can refer to. If you're Rick Perry and you're running for president and someone says, what about the IPCC report? You can say, oh, but I have my NIPCC report. And they say, well, what about this climate change science program? Well, I have my own. I have my own report right here. And it has lots of references. If you look it up, it does. It has 100 pages of references. But, does that actually mean anything in it is right? And, that's an open question. And the other thing to do is you can ask the question, look at the process that produced them. So the IPCC is written by, I won't go into this in great detail, but it's written by a pretty well-defined process where authors are selected by governments. And so it's very hard to imagine that the writers of the IPCC reports would be very biased because how could you imagine that? That would require every government to nominate biased individuals. And believe me, there are plenty of governments that would like nothing more than climate change to disappear. If they could find legitimate climate skeptics to nominate, they would do it. But they just don't exist. So it's really very difficult to imagine how the IPCC could really be biased. If you look at the NIPCC, it's has no process. It doesn't undergo any open peer review. It doesn't, the writers are not, there's no process for selecting the writers in a way that at least nominally ensures there's no bias to it. And then even if you don't believe the IPCC reports, and this is sort of the point I always like to make, especially when you talk to staff of Congress people, there are lots of people who don't believe the IPCC reports, and it's like a four-letter word. I guess it is a four-letter word. And so you point out that there are lots of other authoritative reports. So there's reports from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, there's reports from the U.S. CCSP, there's reports from the UK Royal Society, and I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there are so many of these reports written, and they all say exactly the same thing. You could take every IPCC report ever written, throw it, build a time machine, go back, ensure those were never written, and nothing would change. That there are so many other reports that say exactly the same thing. But then there's this one NIPCC and this Cato report, and there's but there's something else that you can believe if you don't want to believe the mainstream view. And again, makes an important point that, so Fred Singer, I'll talk a little bit about him. So he's one of the lead authors of the NIPCC report, and again, it's published by the Heartland Institute. And the thing that kind of struck me when I was sort of studying the history of this is not only are the arguments the same arguments, but a lot of the people are the same. It's actually the same people who are arguing about tobacco are now arguing about climate change. So they're making the same arguments, the same people. So here's something from 1996 from the Heartland Institute. So it should probably you should not be surprised at all that they don't believe smoking is bad for your health, and they don't want to see regulations on tobacco. And it's a legitimate policy argument to say we shouldn't regulate tobacco. That's a policy argument, not a scientific argument. But from a scientific argument, there's no debate. We know tobacco is bad for your health. Similarly, Fred Singer, the lead author of the Nitpick, that's what my father calls the NIPCC. I think that's actually an excellent name. He doesn't accept the science. And I've talked to him about this, and it's really hard for him to get a straight answer out of him because he knows how untenable arguing against the health impacts of smoking are, in this case, secondhand smoke. And then, and of course, Fred doesn't believe in acid rain. He doesn't believe in nuclear winter. He doesn't think the science is solid. He doesn't believe in ozone depletion. And of course, he doesn't believe in climate change. And so, he's been, every environmental problem, sort of major environmental issue the last 30 years, he hasn't believed the science. And so, that by itself doesn't tell you anything other than, I think if you look back at his arguments about ozone depletion, for example, I mean, I've known Fred since my days in grad school working on ozone. His arguments for ozone weren't any good, and they were all essentially disproven. And now he kind of admits he was wrong on ozone, and he's making essentially exactly the same arguments about climate now. So let's change gears now and ask a question about why. Why do this? Why does this work? And the thing about it is that we all know we should listen to experts. And really, if you use your head and you kind of look around, you look at like the efforts the TPPF had to go through to have a balanced panel on climate. I mean, they had to fly these people in from out of state. It's not hard to realize that essentially all the experts, you just walk down there may be some AGU members here, walk down the Atmospheric Science Hall at an AGU meeting, go to an AMS meeting, walk the halls. You'll see there's really not a lot of debate on these. I mean, maybe there's a few people that disagree, but very, very few. And so why does it work? Why is it that you can present this alternate reality that people will glom onto and people will adopt that? And you'll have Rick Perry citing this. And you'll have Greg Abbott, who in 2010, he sued the EPA on their endangerment finding and used a lot of the same arguments. And I'm going to show you some data from the cultural, this is not stuff I've done, but some stuff that someone named Dan Kahan at Yale has done, which I think is really good. So I was on a panel at the Nature Conservancy, had the two of us on a panel about a year ago, and he showed this data, and I was just blown away. I mean, as a scientist, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of sitting in a room and seeing data up there, and you look at it, you just say, of course. And you can get up and you can walk out at that point because, that solved the problem. And that's essentially how I felt when I saw his data. And it really, the data I'm going to show you in a second really explains a lot about why the argument is so bitter. And also, it tells you why it's going to be so hard to resolve this problem. And so let's begin with a scatter plot of, this is where you fall in a political spectrum. So, this is Rick Perry, this is Elizabeth Warren, Hillary Clinton or Obama would probably be about here. I view them as pretty centrists. And what they've done is they've asked, and they have a way to figure out where you are by asking you questions. What do you think about the role of government? What do you think about, they can ask a bunch of questions, and the social scientists come up with a scale. And then they ask them what they thought about climate. And you can see that if you're very conservative, the vast majority of people don't think climate change is an issue. And if you're very liberal, you're very worried about climate change. And at some level, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, how worried you are about climate change is by and large a scientific issue, which ought to transcend politics. So this is really a puzzling result. And there are two hypotheses that we can advance to ask the question about why this exists. I'll skip that. So one idea is what we call, what Kahan calls the public irrationality theorem, and that is that people don't know enough. If you educate people about climate, there will be this convergence between liberals and conservatives. And the way it's drawn here, they'll all think it's more worrisome. Maybe that doesn't happen. Maybe it converges here, maybe it converges here. But it's going to converge somewhere. So the reason that there's this polarization where conservatives are not worried and liberals are worried is basically because lack of knowledge of climate. And so they actually did the experiment by sorting the responses by how much science the people knew. And by and large, they found the more science they knew, the more polarized they were. I mean, it's shocking that explaining climate science to people, the amount of science they comprehend, has no impact on the polarization. In fact, it makes it worse. And so one of the lessons here is that giving people facts is not the solution to getting convergence on this issue. It's not. It absolutely doesn't work. In fact, it makes things worse. And I can tell you, I have had plenty of experience where I'll be talking to someone who doesn't know a lot, and but who doesn't want to believe climate change is real, and I'll start giving them facts. And not only do I not convince them, but they get angry, and they get entrenched and dug in. And these are smart people who just don't want to believe it. And so there's a second hypothesis, which is that it has to do with your cognition, how you view the world. And so they did a set of experiments. And so this is a skin cream experiment. And they asked the question, people used a skin cream. Of the people who used a skin cream, 223, the rash got better, 75, the rash got worse. Patients who did not use a skin cream, 107 got better, 21 got worse. Now, I won't ask for a show of hands. I'll tell you the answer. If you work it out, if you use a skin cream, 75% of the people got better. If you don't use a skin cream, 80% of the people got better. So the skin cream does not work. You ought to be able to look at the data and determine that the skin cream doesn't work. And they randomized the columns so as not to have some intrinsic bias. And this is what the results look like. So the x-axis here is how numerate people are, how good they are at math. Whoops. And this is whether they got the right answer. You see, people that are really good at math get the right answer. And that's not surprising. If you're good at math, these people, hard to believe it's below 50%, but apparently they get it wrong. They get it wrong more than half the time, so it's worse than a coin flip. But in any event, this kind of makes sense. These people they're not good at math. They don't get the right answer. These people are good at math. They get the right answer. And this makes sense when you segregate it by political philosophy. Skin cream has no salience in policy. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat to whether skin cream works. And so there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats on where they get the answer. The Republicans who are good at math and the Democrats who are good at math get it right. The ones who are bad at math get it wrong. And so this doesn't matter. But now let's look at a different problem. Let's look at exactly the same problem, but this time we're talking about banning guns. So banning guns does have political salience. It does matter. Republicans don't like to see data that supports banning guns. Democrats do not want to see data that supports not banning guns. And so they did the exact same thing. Cities that did ban guns, these are the same numbers, and so the answer actually is exactly the same. For cities that did ban guns, crime went down in 75% of them. In cities that did not ban guns, crime went down in 80% of them. So these data would say that banning guns does not work. And so let's look to see how people did. So just and then they randomized it to avoid any biases in how the question was asked. So again, this is the skin cream problem. No political difference in that. We look at gun control, you see something quite different. And this really blew me away. I mean, when I saw this, I think intuitively I knew this was true, but until I saw the data, I wouldn't have been bold enough to suggest it. And that is that if you give people data that they don't want to see, they don't see it. So if you show a Democrat evidence that banning guns increases the crime, even the ones that are good at math don't get the right answer. You show a Republican evidence that banning guns decreases crime, they don't get the right answer. They don't see what they don't want to see. If you show them the data that agrees with them, they do get it right. I mean, this is amazing, to me at least. This was shocking that people see the facts they want to see. And of course, these people don't get the answer right in any event, so it doesn't matter what they want to see. They can't figure out if it agrees or not. And so, this is normal. So look at this top plot. So the black is conservatives, the green are liberals, and this is fluoridation. So this is how many people are worried about the risk of fluoridation. And you see there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats. There are a few nut jobs up here that think fluoridation is bad for you, but they're more as likely to be Republicans as they are Democrats. And this is normal. This is exactly what you see. This is medical x-rays. This is normal. You don't expect to see a political split on this. You expect some people to be wrong, but you don't necessarily think it's going to be one ideology more than the other. It's just people are just going to be wrong. But the thing is, if we look at climate, this is pathological. I mean, this is why you can't get anywhere on the climate problem, basically. And it's because, there are a lot of people out there that view the world in the way they want to see it. And the important thing to realize is that individuals are being rational. So this is a classic, what we call tragedy of the commons. Individuals are being rational. If you're a barber in South Carolina and you're cutting hair, what benefit is it to you to talk to your clients that you're really worried about climate change? They're going to walk out there and they're going to think, that guy's crazy. And they'll say, hey, Joe, the barber was telling me he's worried about climate change. And the guy's going to shake his head and they're going to go somewhere else. So, if you're a member of a group, you just kind of go along with it. That's the rational thing to do, especially because climate change for the barber probably isn't going to affect him. He can't do anything about it. He'll be long dead before he may think. I'm not sure it's true. He probably thinks he'll be long dead before the impacts come. So, the easiest thing to do is just to go along with it. But if you do that, while that's rational for you, that's bad for society because the net result means society is not converging using the best science to get to the answer. And so it's a classic, what people would call a tragedy of the commons type situation. In fact, I call it the tragedy of the science communication commons. And so I'll sort of sum up with this slide and just sort of a few things to remember. Telling people facts doesn't convince them. So if there's anything that the undergrads want to hear, in many, not in all cases, in things that don't have political salience, that aren't political touchstone issues, telling people facts can convince them. But in many issues, especially the ones that are really hot button issues like climate, telling people facts about climate does not help. And people reach their conclusions using their worldview. You look at all the data and you see the data you want to see. And it's sort of shocking that happens. I've seen people get really angry when you show them this data. There are probably people in the audience that are, how dare he say that? But, the data are data. And, it's clear that in the experiments, that's what happens. In my own experiences, that's what happens. People will watch it. I will post talks on YouTube that I give. And I have lots of examples, but I'll just sort of say that people will pick out these snippets where I say something like, Northern Hemisphere winter does appear to be cooling. And they'll be blogging. He admits the Northern Hemisphere winter is cooling, where the sentence before that was, all the other seasons are rapidly warming. And that, but they just ignore that. They don't ignore that. They just see that Northern Hemisphere winter is cooling. So people do this. And again, this is rational behavior for the individual, but it's pathological for society. And essentially, the alternate reality infrastructure, the Oregon petition, the NIPCC reports, all of the arguments that diminish expertise fit in, help people do this. There's this hunger for people to dismiss the mainstream view of climate science. And so there are all of these tools people have to do that. Well, what about this website? And what about this report? And what about this? And what about this? And so people have an answer for everything. You go online, which I don't recommend, and try to understand something about climate. And there's no claim that somebody can't rebut with a link. Oh, here's a link to something. And so it makes for this really pathological situation where you don't converge on the right science. And the solution, lots of people talk about lots of things. People talk about, well, we need to change public opinion. Changing public opinion will not help. I don't remember the exact polling numbers, but I do believe that it was about 80% of the people were in favor of background checks on guns, and they still couldn't get it through the Senate. 80% of the people were in favor of regulations on climate, will not go anywhere. What we need to do is change the way the groups think about climate. So just as an example, a lot of the people opposed to action on climate, it was one of the clips I skipped, was them talking about how climate is a stalking horse for big government. And so, you have to make the argument that climate regulations are actually not a stalking horse for big government. In fact, climate change regulations will probably prevent big government. Because if you think about it, when are the times the government really interferes with our lives? It's after disasters. That's when they send the National Guard in. It's after Katrina floods New Orleans. That's when the Army goes in. If there's a food shortage, you need to ration. The government is going to step in. They're going to ration the food. They're not going to let the free market decide who starves to death. And so, if you really want the government out of your life, you have to make sure we don't have big environmental catastrophes, because that's when the government will intervene. So I try to make that argument. We'll see if that works. But I know the other things don't work. So I'm always trying, as a scientist, I always like to run the experiment. So anyway, I'll wrap up there, and I'm happy to answer questions about anything climate related, science or politics.
Yeah, so let me end. So we're going to bring a mic around, and I'll just ask the mic. Whoever's got the mic first can talk first, please.
Thanks. Thank you. Enjoyed your talk. There is one dimension here that's vastly different from the big tobacco argument. In the case of tobacco, there is an alternative where you can stop smoking, and that's a perfectly healthy thing to do. But with regard to doing something about climate change, i.e. decarbonizing society, there's this whole new dialogue that, hey, there is really no alternative to fossil fuel combustion. It's, in fact, the CEO of Peabody Coal gave an interview last week, and he said he called renewable energy, he called it boutique energy, sort of like, if you do this is like expensive spa food that you get at Whole Foods. This is not a real energy alternative. How do you respond to that?
Well, I certainly hope eventually we have renewable energy, because we're going to run out of fossil fuels. And if we don't, our civilization will disappear if we don't have renewable energy at some point. As far as the question about right now, I agree completely. We cannot turn off fossil fuels tomorrow, and nobody advocates that. Nobody advocates shutting down coal-fired power plants tomorrow. But I do think that with the right incentives and with the right technology program, over the next few decades, I was trying to tell my kids that there was no iPhone 10 years ago. They couldn't believe it. I mean, technology changes amazingly rapidly. And I do think that if we start now and we make it clear we're going to tackle the problem, the technology will come along. The problem right now is there's no incentive for individual companies to make big investments in this. Because, is there going to be a policy? It only really makes sense if you internalize the price of carbon. And if you don't do that, then why should a company invest in renewable energy development, energy storage? We need to do energy storage. So who's going to work on battery technology? People at MIT are, the federal government's funding it, but you need private industry to do that. And the way you get them to do it is you tell them there's going to be a price on carbon that's going to rise over the next few decades. And then you'll get the technology. I mean, I don't know how it'll work out. I hope there's an alternative that's reasonably cheap. But as of right now, I see no reason to think that it's hopeless that over the next few decades we can't transition.
So would you say your talk is about, as far as alternative realities go, what ideology you attach your ego to, be it free market fundamentalism versus regulatory oversight?
If I had to say, I would consider myself a centrist. I like Obama. I think Obama's a centrist. I like freedom. I don't want the government telling me what to do. On the other hand, I also see that there's a role for regulation. You look at the Clean Air Act. It was government regulation that cleaned up the atmosphere. So I think that I consider myself in the middle. I like freedom, but I do think there's a role for government regulation.
Yeah, I was just referring to the class of ideologies.
Yeah.
I would like to share with you a challenge I had last week. A Fox News reporter covering that TPPF conference downtown called me up and said, I'd like to get a little controversy on this, an alternative viewpoint. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Can you come up with a graphic for me, single graphic? And I thought, okay, this is going to be a soundbite presentation. What is my one sentence? What two things, graphic and sentence, would you come up with in that situation?
He wanted controversy. He wanted you to make an argument that climate change is real and show you something. I'd show him the 100-year temperature record. If you average the decades, every decade is clearly warmer than the previous decade. And then, point out that, you always mark, people say the climate isn't warming, you mark 2005 and 2010 as the two warmest years in the record. If the climate's not warming, why is 2010 the warmest year, along with 2005? It's hard to do those things. The main thing I would do is I would just say I'm busy. because the bottom line is these kind of arguments over science are not changing anybody's mind, and they waste your time. I sort of hate to say that. I do think there are people who legitimately want to know more about science, and for them it's probably good, but it's very difficult if you really try to argue science when it's really ideology that's driving this.
Using the tobacco industry from the 60s, and it's obviously progressed, it's evolved, there's a life cycle to an alternative reality that's imposed through whatever economic power of a special interest group. Is there any what have you looked at what it is that causes? What is the progression or the life cycle of an alternative reality like this, given the fact that it's quite reversed? We know the tobacco industry can't get away anymore with doing what they were doing then and for several decades.
Right. So the tobacco alternative reality fell apart in the 90s during litigation. So a bunch of state attorney generals sued them. And they took it to court, they got all these documents. And up until that point, they really, they stood to it. Nicotine's not addictive, there's no evidence. And so if you ask the question of how long tobacco took, it's about 40 years. From the mid-50s, when the big longitudinal studies were finished, to the mid-90s. So let's hope it's not 40 years for climate. If you want to argue 1990 is the year that maybe 95 is the year that we really sort of started understanding the human influence. If it's 40 years, we're cooked. No pun intended. We're going to release enough carbon between then. If we don't start doing stuff until 2035, we're going to release enough carbon to commit ourselves to very large warmings over the end of the 21st century. So it could be, 40 years before people. Now, the one thing that could change that is the weather. So, it's getting hotter. I grew up in Texas in the 70s, and I guarantee it was colder than it is in the summers now. In fact, the 70s were the coldest decade of the last 150 years. And so the 70s were actually very pleasant in Houston. It is not pleasant now in College Station if it's a heat wave. It's 108, it's 109. And I think those are the kinds of things that might speed it up. But it could take decades for this to really sort of go through a cycle. Let's hope not.
I've read that Anthony Watt's website gets something like 2 million unique visitors per month. It's incredibly popular. The thing is now, but he says he's never taken any money from any oil companies or any of these foundations. It seems to be totally a bottom-up grassroots movement. And I was wondering, it seems completely independent of the merchants of doubt reality that Naomi Orskes has taken about. So do you know if there's any hidden source of funding for him, or is this just a spontaneous movement?
Yeah, I have to tell you, I disagree with a lot of other people. I think very few people in the climate debate are in it for the money. I mean, maybe, the CEO of Murray Energy or Peabody Coal, maybe those guys are in front of it, but there aren't very many of them. Most of the people in there are true believers. It's really an ideological battle about government activity. You sort of say, when did it arise? It arose right at the same time healthcare was going through sort of this uber pushback on climate. And so I think if he says he doesn't get any money, I believe him. I think, I think he has advertising on his web. If he gets 2 million hits a month, I wonder how much he gets in advertising revenue. But be as it may, I think most of the people in the debate on both sides, very few people are getting rich, unless you're an Exxon CEO or something. I mean, they're probably getting rich.
This is very U.S. focused. The climate issue is a global issue. The president of India was just here. He said their country is going to be using coal and growing coal use for the next 20 or 30 years. China is now 50% of the coal market. What are the ideological drivers of those countries? Because they're really going to be driving the growth in CO2 over the next 20 years, not the United States, right. Not Europe.
Right. Well, okay, I know a lot more about China than India. So China is driven by, the rulers of China are driven not to be up against the wall in a firing squad. I mean, if they don't Tiananmen Square, they essentially made an agreement with the people that we will deliver economic growth. In fact, even before that, they were liberalizing the economy. They were delivering economic growth. As long as people keep getting richer, you don't have, the country stays together. And I think that their worry is that there'll be political destabilization if they don't deliver growth. They look at regulating carbon as a potential threat to their growth and the stability of the country. I mean, if the country fell apart, that would be a global disaster. China's such a big part of the world economy now. And so that really drives them. On the other hand, their air pollution is terrible. If you've ever been to China, you can barely breathe if you go outside. I mean, it's awful. And you look out the window and you think it's raining, and then you look down and you realize it's just smoggy. I mean, it's really unbelievable. So they've got a real problem on their hands. Now, the subtext of your question, which let me address, is how do you get around that? As a world, you have these countries that don't want to reduce. I mean, that's really the question. And the answer to that is you do it the same way we handled ozone depletion, which is the developing countries develop the technology by phasing it out first. The US and Europe and the other developing countries phased out fluorocarbons in the late 80s and through the 90s. And they developed the replacement technology that was so cheap and so easy that the other countries just adopted it. And I think that's the way you get India and China on board. The US has to deploy, and Europe is already doing it. The US sort of has to join them in the R&D necessary to do that. And then the question is, well, how do you do the R&D? Well, you convince people there's going to be a price on carbon. And then that's how the R&D gets done. And then you develop technology, develop energy storage technology, develop cheaper solar PV technology. I mean, that's the way to do it. You're never going to get the problem solved without new technology.
So who's got the mics? You need a mic.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello?
Well, Naomi Klein published a paper lately claiming that capitalism is responsible for global warming. It seems in the circles in Herman Daly's world that people believe that the denialists or the authors of denial have a better grip on what it would take to solve the global warming problem, if it could ever be solved. It may be too late, but if it can be solved, it's probably not possible to retain market economies and capitalism. On the other hand, the liberals who are against climate change don't seem to be willing to do enough. They recommend measures that are too little and too late. What would you say to that?
Yeah, okay, so the first part about, I think there's no question, if you read any economic analysis of climate change, that climate change is a side effect of economic activity. you consume goods and services. It requires energy to produce those goods and services. And the more goods and services you consume, the more emissions you have, the more climate change. So there's no question that there's a link between economic growth. Now, this is one of the reasons why it's philosophically such a hard problem, that the people who are causing climate change are actually doing something virtuous. They're not stealing your bike and intending to harm. They're actually they're producing stuff that people want. They're doing social activities. So that is right. I would reject the idea that you can't have a democracy and solve climate change. I mean, nobody knows what it's going to take to solve climate change. And so what I tell people is we should start now. And if it turns out it's too hard, then let if in 10 or 20 years we realize we just can't do it, then you start geoengineering. You do something else. But I think anybody who tells you they know how hard it's going to be has not seriously looked at the problem, because nobody knows how fast technology will develop. But again, I tell my kids there were no iPads before 2010. They're even more amazed at that there were no iPhones before 2007. I mean, it's like you didn't have an iPad growing up? It's like they literally cannot believe that. So technology moves fast, and I think that I'm optimistic that if you deploy the right market incentives, we'll develop the technology to do it. And we did it we've solved all of these other problems. We've cleaned up the air, we solved ozone depletion, we solved acid rain. It was all done much easier than the people said it would be before.
That's with economic growth as well?
Sure. I mean, I don't know how much. Maybe there'll be instead of growing at 3%, we grow at 2%. I mean, nobody knows how hard it's going to be. That's the point. And nobody knows what the until you try, you don't know. And so my personal opinion, speaking as a citizen, not as a scientist, my policy opinion is that we should start down the road now and see how hard it is. And I think it's going to turn out to be much easier than people think. Because you got to remember, the people that are telling you it's going to be really hard, they don't want to do anything. So they have an incentive. And if you look at the ozone depletion debate, before we phased out fluorocarbons, those people were telling you, you're going to have to give up your air conditioner, you're going to have to give up your refrigerator, millions of people in Africa will starve. I mean, none of that turned out to be right. So when someone tells me these doom and gloom scenarios, in my mind I'm thinking, why am I listening to you? These doom and gloom scenarios are always wrong. And if it turns out to be right, it's reversible. You just stop doing it.
One more question.
I don't think Exxon's changed their perspective on global warming yet. Have you heard anything recently about that?
I have to say, I don't follow all of the energy I don't follow all of the companies that closely. I know a while back they had internal documents that assumed some kind of carbon tax. And I think they recently, I remember hearing the CEO saying something like his plan is to pump as much oil as possible. So I think it kind of changes. And like when one CEO goes, like BP was very renewable or more renewable energy focused. They said BP stands for Beyond Petroleum. And then the guy who was in charge retired and someone new came in and they scrapped that. I think it goes with the cycles.
Andy, thank you very much for provocative comments on a very important issue. I want to thank everybody for coming. We expect we will have more talks along these lines in the coming year, and we hope you will join us for those. So again, thank our speaker. Thank you. Appreciate everything worked okay.
Yeah, okay.